So let me go ahead and cover and talk more about, of course, the Teddy Roosevelt era. Before we were talking about the building of the Panama Canal, which the United States, if you remember correctly, we had talked about previously that other lecture how the United States had built this canal. And by the way, the building of the canal, I think I mentioned this before, was one of Teddy Roosevelt's greatest successes as president. Some people don't like this because they feel like they're trying to take over part of Latin America, but it was really a great idea, great success story. And of course, you saw in the video that it shortened the length between, going between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. Before, you had to sail around South America, which took a long time. I already told you how previously they had created that treaty with, of course, Panama in 1903, the Hay-Bonao-Varia Treaty, which gave them the land for it to build it. We of course got a 99-year lease on about 10-mile strip of land. We paid the Panamanians $10 million. They agreed to a rental agreement of $250,000. So a pretty good deal. I'd take that deal with me. It's good money, huh? At least for now. Back then it was pretty good money. But it would take a long time for us to build it. It took us like 10 years to actually construct and build the actual Panama Canal. There's a lot of difficulties in building this canal. You got the fact that the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean are at different sea levels. Then you got part of, Panama. It was difficult trying to, put a canal through there because if you know what they did, they put a artificial lake in there to so they didn't have to cut out so much land to build it. It was constructed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. One of the men behind it was George Washington Girdles, who was an Army general and civil engineer. He's the one who actually designed and built the Panama Canal. What you see there was a 51-mile waterway that connected the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. And if you watch the video, a lot of people worked on it. Thousands of workers, although most of the workers, which was about 56,000, were mostly gotten from what is the Caribbean, mostly African people, blacks from the Caribbean, mostly constructed the actual Panama Canal. Cost about $400 million. I don't think the video, they talked about that, I think. I don't know what that is in money today. It's got to be 3-4 times what it cost back then to actually build it. And but only 10% of the workers actually died. At least I think most of those are Americans that may have died or whatever, but not that many people died compared to like when the French tried to build a canal in Nicaragua. I think they had more people that died from that. One more thing about the Panama Canal. Of course, they were talking about the lock systems that they built in there. But you see one behind me. There's a lock right there. I don't know if you can see that or not. If I get out the way here, you can kind of see one of the locks that they have right there. And they have like 12 of these locks that they constructed, on both sides, on Atlantic side, the Pacific side. And each lock was about 110 feet wide. I think I've got a picture of some of the locks. There's one lock I know I've got. Where is that one with a lock, which is right here, where they would put ships through it. You can see mostly made of concrete and steel that you're looking at. So they would put these in there and built those. This map shows you basically where they were. So you got some locks that are over here, and then there's some locks over there. So you got the Gatun locks over here, and you got these other locks over there. So you got the Pacific side and the Atlantic side. Then they dammed this area up in here, and they formed this huge artificial lake called Gatun Lake. They did that so they wouldn't have to cut through that whole area. So they only had to really cut through two main areas, like right here and I think mostly up in here. And so that made it a lot easier for them to build this railroad. And after it was opened, Roosevelt actually went down there and inspected it and all that. So that's what was going on. I think most of the people that died in the whole thing were predominantly French workers that died building the one in Nicaragua. So I think they're talking about 80,000 workers as in total, like what the French were trying to do before, and then what the Americans did with most of the Caribbean labor that was built later. Here's a picture, better yet, of one of the locks that we're looking at. So I think there was some kind of information about that I didn't get to show you too much about it, but there you go. So that's some little statistics on it, but you can see the amount of ships that goes through it annually is probably at least close to 15,000 or more go through it after it was finished in 1914. So a lot of export, import type goods, go through there. And of course, later we gave it back to Panama, if you know about this, in 1999. That was kind of controversial I think Jimmy Carter decided to do that. And it was under President Bill Clinton that we officially gave it back to him and all that. So that's the Panama Canal, and, why it's important for, a lot of commerce, throughout the world, shipping commerce. Without that, you have to go around South America. All right, let's go ahead and move on. And I want to go ahead and, of course, talk about the William Howard Taft administration that we, of course, we're going to get to next and talk about. So Taft, he's the next president that comes in after Teddy Roosevelt decides not to run. Teddy could have run for a third term. It's possible. He hadn't really quite served, 8 years. But I think Teddy was like, I guess he thought he was going to follow the same unwritten rule as George Washington did years ago when Washington only served 2 terms. There was no really rule yet. There was no 22nd Amendment stopping you from really running for more than 2 terms. So if you know what happened, Teddy Roosevelt decided to handpick his successor, and so he picked William Howard Taft. Taft was actually a former judge, like a federal judge, and then also he was the Secretary of War. He was from Ohio, and it's been very few presidents have been able to handpick who their successor would be. I think if you remember correctly, there was I think Andrew Jackson did that years ago with Van Buren, and there was a joke about Taft that he didn't really want to even be president. I think he said famously, "I hate politics." That was his famous quote. I think he really wanted to be a lawyer and judge. He had also been a professor at Yale. And later on, if you know about it, he's a Supreme Court justice. He's actually a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court that's appointed by President Warren G. Harding. It's a little later, in the 1920s, I think it is. But yeah, there was an old joke about Taft, which was that the name Taft really stood for take advice from Teddy, is what the name really meant. Taft ran against William Jennings Bryan, who was running for I think his second time running? I forget how many times he ran too many times. And I think I've got a picture showing that. So Taft versus Bryan. And I think, no, that's his third time running, I guess. I think Bryan ran like 4 times. And that election, of course, you can see here, wasn't really that close. And Bryan, of course, lost to Taft. You can see, even though Bryan did get pretty much the solid South voted for him as a Democrat. But in 1908, that wasn't enough. And so Taft came in and became president of the United States. So pretty much that's him right there you're looking at. Taft, of course, would only serve 1 term, 1909 to 1913. Yeah, you can see there, later he was appointed as Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. I think he's the only president, that's done that, as far as I remember. I think Taft's the only president that ever became like a Supreme Court justice, at least one that was like Chief Justice overall. That's something Taft was known for. Taft was famous for a lot of things. I don't really have that to put up on the screen for you, but Taft was known for being, I don't think we got a better picture of showing Taft or not, but he was known for being one of the fattest U.S. presidents don't know if this one's a better one or not. They called him the Big Lub. I think he weighed like 300 something pounds. And there's a story where he was in the White House. He was taking a bath and he couldn't get out because he got stuck. He got stuck in the bathtub. So they had to literally find a new bathtub for him. He was that big. Now, Taft was controversial. The reason why Taft was controversial was because he was kind of seen as this. He was kind of unpopular. He wasn't very popular. I mean, he's this guy coming in after Teddy Roosevelt, who's like real big, popular guy. And Teddy was a big war hero and all that. And so people didn't really like him. Teddy Roosevelt didn't like him either. Even though he handpicks the guy, he finds out he doesn't really like him and wished he probably shouldn't have run a third time, probably, imagine. And Taft was seen as this reactionary to a lot of the progressive ideas. He's kind of seen as being almost more pro-big business, but he's still kind of seen as a trust buster. That's one of the ironic things about Taft. Taft was, I think some people have a false analogy about Taft. They think that he was this reactionary bad guy, whatever, but he actually did some positive things. He was a trust buster that some people don't forget about. He did actually sponsor twice as many antitrust cases as Teddy Roosevelt did. I think up to about 90 cases. There was even, of course, the most famous one, the Standard Oil 1911, was broken up into like 34 companies due to a court case that went all the way to the Supreme Court, Standard Oil Company of New Jersey versus the United States. So yeah, he did some stuff like that as well. He also started regulating all the telecommunications stuff. So he did that too. He helped sign into law the Mann-Elkins Act, passed in 1920. What did that do? It gave the ICC, Interstate Commerce Commission, if you remember correctly, I talked about that before, the authority to regulate like all telephone companies, telegraphs, cables, wireless type radio we talked about before. So all that was basically, starting to be regulated because of Taft signing that into law. So yeah, there were some positive things like that as an example that, came about at that time. However, there was this thing that really made everybody mad. Here's the Mann-Elkins Act. If you want to look at that later, a slide on that one right there. They had the Payne-Aldrich Tariff. And that was something that kind of angered a lot of people that he helped eventually sign into law, sponsor it and all that. And I think originally, when he ran on lowering tariffs, and then he changed his mind and he raised tariffs. So it angered him, of course. And what was it? The Payne-Aldrich Act of 1909. It increased tariffs on many imported goods that were coming into the country. And pretty much not just the Democrats, but a lot of the progressive Republicans had been in favor of, having lower tariffs. They think that had, helped the economy before. And that really angered. That was one of the things that set off Teddy Roosevelt. He really realized that he didn't like Taft anymore and wished that he wouldn't have, stepped down. I wish he could have, run again for a third term. Because later on it's going to, want Teddy to run again, which he will in 1912. So a lot of people kind of were betrayed by it, when of course he did that and all that. Then foreign policy wise, that was another thing that was different about Taft. Taft went away from Teddy Roosevelt's gunboat diplomacy, the big stick policy that he had used before. And he went to what they call Taft's dollar diplomacy. That's what he called it. And dollar diplomacy, which replaced it, was an idea where they would use American dollars to control America's sphere of influence over Latin America. And they used it to replace gunboat diplomacy. So instead of using the idea of force, they basically tried to bribe Latin America with money, and stuff like that. And so they called it dollar diplomacy. So you can see here some of the stuff they did. American bankers lent money to Central American countries. U.S. government encouraged investment in Latin America, like in mines, banana plantations, coffee plantations, building railroads, and all that. So anyway, so that's something we started doing. And so we were kind of trying to bribe them, give them money to, gain friends and allies. But even if we did that stuff, they still hated us anyway. Called us Yankees and Yankee go home and all that stuff, which is true still. Still like that today. I think they feel like that way, But I think TR didn't like that policy. I think he preferred the other policy, over, the dollar diplomacy that we talked about before. So basically, because of all that happening with, the Payne-Aldrich thing and the dollar diplomacy, basically in 1912, there's a deal where there's a split that occurs in the Republican Party over the issue of Taft. And of course, what ends up happening, of course, is that Teddy Roosevelt, who feels, betrayed by this whole thing, decides to run again for president. He's kind of angry about Taft. Taft doesn't seem to be as progressive like he was and all that. So in the 1912 election, Teddy Roosevelt decides to run for a third term for the presidency. So he's feels betrayed by it and all that. And Teddy Roosevelt, in a speech in 1912, came up with this new progressive program. It was part of a speech he gave originally in 1910 in Kansas, which was called New Nationalism. So the term New Nationalism became like his main platform that he decided to run on. And these were progressive reforms that were supposed to aid the common public over, say, big business in general, and even thought about like rights for women and things like that. There's some stuff about the New Nationalism platform. Those are some of the things that, of course, were part of it. It was eventually part of what eventually becomes, which I'll get to in a little bit, the Progressive Party of Teddy Roosevelt, later called the Bull Moose Party. And those are the major issues that he talked about, of course, which is he wanted women's suffrage, to give women the right to vote. These are ideas that have been around a while, which the amendment hasn't come out yet to do that yet, but it will later when Woodrow Wilson comes in later. Stricter child labor laws to prevent children from having to work, things like that. That was another thing he came up with. Backed labor unions. So he wanted to basically come out and say, hey, we're in support of labor unions, which is the average Joe out there. It's working over the big business or whatever. So he comes out as one of the first presidential candidates in history, at least modern ones, right? That time, main party anyway, to support the idea of labor unions. He wanted a national retirement system, like Social Security later. He first came up with that idea too. He wanted an 8-hour workday. It's been around, the idea, but he wanted to make that nationwide overall. So you see that slide right there about new nationalism. Also, national health care. You can see in that little slide there. Yeah, he actually had that idea too. The idea of national health care for people, minimum wage for women, stuff like that. So those are the kind of things he kind of is coming up with. Also, another things that he also wanted to do too, he wanted, of course, to lower tariffs because that's, one of the things that caused the rift with Taft, supported the idea of initiative, recall, referendum, which we talked about before, which started in Wisconsin, the Wisconsin idea. He wanted to push that nationally, make that something that's everywhere and all that. So these are all things that Teddy Roosevelt, pushed in 1912. However, what happened was the Republicans decided that they were going to go with Taft and not Teddy Roosevelt. I think in 1912, I think it was around the summer, August of 1912, I think it is, Republicans had their national convention in Chicago, and they chose William Howard Taft as the Republican presidential nominee over the idea of Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt tried to put his name in and a few others, but eventually Taft got the nomination. This angered, of course, Teddy Roosevelt and his supporters, and so they actually broke from the Republican National Convention in Chicago, and they created their own convention also at Chicago about the same time, around August as well. They decided to form a new party, which became known as the Progressive Party. And they went on to nominate, of course, Teddy Roosevelt as their president. I think it was the only time they ever ran. I think they tried to run in 1912, but they didn't. But they ran, of course, Teddy Roosevelt as the presidential nominee. They picked a Californian governor named Hiram Johnson as his vice president, like nominee. He was, I think, a progressive as well. Now, if you know about the name of this party, it was called the Bull Moose Party. And people, of course, always wonder, like, why was it called the Bull Moose Party? Well, there was an incident that happened when he was campaigning in 1912. He was given a campaign speech in 1912. This man came up to him who had a revolver, and he shot him. He actually did an attempted assassination on Teddy Roosevelt. Here, I think I've got a headline showing like him getting shot, which is right here. There's a guy I think he was insane, I think is what it was. He was a kind of a maniac, I guess, or something was mentally wrong with him. And but he shot him in the chest. The bullet, I think, it ricocheted off of his glasses, and I think his campaign speech, which was inside of his pocket, inside of his breast pocket. Afterwards, he said a statement. He said, "I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." And so he actually got wounded, refused to go to the hospital, and spoke for an hour or so, like a campaign speech, and then went to the hospital afterwards. That was a really tough guy. I think he got slightly wounded, but it didn't kill him or nothing. And so that's where basically the term came from. That's why they nicknamed his party the Bull Moose Party. So also supposedly he said something like also to the effect that there's a statement that Teddy Roosevelt said where he said, "I feel as strong as a bull moose." And so that's basically, they say another version of that too as well. Now, now another thing that's interesting about the 1912 election that I did want to mention about, which is kind of famous. They had other people that ran too that I wanted to kind of talk about a few seconds. Of course, the other two that ran as well. There was actually 4 people running in this election, which is crazy. So it's nuts. You got Teddy Roosevelt, you got Taft, then you got the socialist Eugene V. Debs, who had run before. I think he ran like 4 times. This is actually Eugene Debs did the best in 1912. Debs actually, of course, came in 4th, but he actually pulled almost 1 million votes. So it was like 900-something thousand people actually voted for him. And so when Eugene Debs ran in 1912, that was really the peak of the American Socialist Party. People think of socialism today, some of these political parties, like maybe the Democrats, getting more like they're going towards socialism, but that was the peak of socialism in America, was 1912. And then after World War I, people started kind of going away from it due to like the first, second Red Scares, which of course is later. Then, of course, they had Woodrow Wilson. He was the 4th guy that ran, of course. which we'll talk about next. He, of course, Woodrow Wilson, was a Democratic governor from New Jersey, who, of course, was a progressive. He was a progressive reformer. And I've got a picture. Here's, of course, some pictures of Wilson here. Wilson ran on a platform or program that he called New Freedom, compared to, say, what Teddy Roosevelt was running on, which was called New Nationalism. And they differed in different ways. You can see Wilson believed that government serves social justice best if it gets rid of special interest groups, and desired small enterprise to function freely in the, the market, the free market, and all that. And so that's one thing he ran on. Roosevelt was kind of the opposite. He didn't really want to get rid of the trusts. And I know he was kind of seen as a trust buster, but he didn't want to get rid of all. I think Teddy thought of like good trusts versus bad trusts, that kind of thing. And but he still wanted to help the labor unions and stuff like that, and the average guy. But he just didn't want to break up all these different companies or corporations. And of course, there's Woodrow Wilson right there. A little bit more about Woodrow Wilson. He was originally president of Princeton University at one point. He was actually a historian. He was a lawyer. And then later he was a governor of New Jersey, helped to kind of clean it up and all of that. I'll get to Wilson later. He's kind of controversial for a few reasons. You probably heard about how they took his statue down at Princeton and took its name off buildings. I'll kind of explain a little later about why that is. But it's originally from Virginia, but of course later ended up in New Jersey. And of course would serve 2 terms as president from 1913 to 1921. So he was the 28th president of the United States, of course later, and of course after he was governor of New Jersey. Now, so here's some more stuff there. So he ran on that New Freedom platform. These are some of the things that he ran on, which he ran on really 3 main type of reforms: tariffs, business, and banking reform. So the TBB, I guess you want to call it that. So tariff, business, and banking reforms were the main things he wanted to do. These are some of the things he wanted to do, Woodrow Wilson, with his reforms for the New Freedom platform. He wanted to reduce tariffs. So just like Teddy Roosevelt, he saw that his main thing he wanted to do. He wanted to impose, this is different though, a graduated income tax, something Teddy didn't bring up, by the way. He favored a popular vote of the U.S. senators because a lot of times the governors of states would just appoint people. And so he wanted the people to have more of a say in direct election of their senators to, Washington, D.C. Wanted to create a Federal Reserve System, which is a national banking system. That was considered one of his best things he did. That's probably famous still today. That and the income tax, which I think people don't like. A lot of people don't like the Fed either, about that as well. Also, he wanted stronger antitrust laws, which was probably better than Teddy Roosevelt wanted, because Teddy was kind of divided on that about certain trusts being taken away. And then he wanted a Federal Trade Commission as well to regulate the economy, interstate and foreign trade as well. So those are all his famous platforms that he ran on overall. And pretty much the election that he ran in 1912 actually was, I think it was won it pretty easily. I don't think I've got a map showing you what happened. Oh, actually, I do have a map, which is right here. Wilson ran and won majority of the states. You can see that Wilson came in, of course, first. You can see he won a majority of the states. He got about 6.2, 6.3 million votes. And then, of course, you can see Teddy Roosevelt came in second, 4.1 million. And then Taft came in with 3.4 million. You can see a minority around that amount, close to 1 million, voted for Eugene Debs and I think somebody else, I think it ran also as well. So yeah, that's basically what happened. Pretty much the reason why Woodrow Wilson won was because he divided, the Republicans were divided on their vote. Taft versus Teddy Roosevelt. I think if one or the other had won, I think if maybe Teddy had run, maybe the Republicans could have won that election. But because of it, split the entire Republican vote. And so Wilson was basically able to win with only, you can see, 42% of the popular vote. That's pretty amazing. I think the last time that happened maybe Lincoln when he won in 1860 was kind of like that as well. Oh, the electoral votes are interesting. Woodrow Wilson got 435 electoral votes. Roosevelt, 88. Look at Taft. Taft was the incumbent. He only got 8 electoral votes. It's got to be the worst, attempt at re-election by a presidential incumbent. It's awful, basically. But Taft would later go on to be, like I said, Supreme Court Justice, I think starting around 1921, I think it is. I think under Warren G. Harding, he's appointed, and he's like the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court until like 1930. I think Taft was more into stuff like law and courts. So he had been a judge before. So I was right more up his alley. He didn't really want to be president, I think. He just kind of got pushed into it. All right, so that's basically what happened with, Taft, Wilson, how Wilson came in, of course. Let me get more into Woodrow Wilson, Thomas Woodrow Wilson, of course, his full name with his New Freedom platform that comes in. Now, like I said about Wilson, Wilson, it's kind of controversial, which is true. He was a pretty good, successful president. I don't know if he's not in the top 10, probably, I'm sure. He's got to be at least in the top 15 or 20 presidents of all time. So he's above average, pretty successful U.S. president, did a lot of things that changed the country later on. Now, he's controversial, though. He's got a lot of controversial issues, of course. One of them is racism. They do think maybe he was somewhat racist. There was a case where what was that famous movie? You may have heard about this, where you heard that movie called The Birth of the Nation. It's a famous movie which is about the KKK. Probably heard of that. He actually showed it in the White House. Yeah, that's kind of terrible. So yeah, I can understand why, they view him as that. Also, he's controversial because a lot of people didn't like the income tax. That was one thing he helped kind of bring up, federal income tax. So people didn't like that. He also created the Federal Reserve System, which some people don't like that either. There's one more thing that I think pretty much he helped establish too that people didn't like either. Prohibition of alcohol pretty much started under him, signed the law and all that, the amendment. And so, yeah, those are some things that kind of people didn't really like about Wilson, but he was definitely a progressive, definitely a reform-minded president, when he came in. So he would serve 2 terms as president. You can see 1913 to 1921. And most of his time in his first term, pretty much from 1913 to 1917, are pretty much progressive reforms, or the things he kind of does, which he kind of already started like in New Jersey previously. So let me talk about some things he did, which is famous. The first thing he did was he came up with the Underwood Tariff. And what the Underwood Tariff did was it lowered tariffs, like we had talked about before. Because remember correctly, the Payne-Aldrich Tariff had basically increased tariffs, a lot of them under Taft, and then eventually the Underwood Tariff passed in 1913. That reduced tariffs on a lot of goods that were being imported into the country. And so people that are more progressive, favored that idea, not just in the Democratic but Republican parties. And so it reduced the duties on average, like the cost of tariffs on a lot of products on average from 41 to 29%. So not quite halved it, but it decreased it quite a lot. Now, there was a provision in it that was kind of like, controversial, that some people didn't like that they put in it. But some of the congressmen put in, of course, the provision about a graduated income tax that they stuck in there. However, they were kind of concerned that it would be considered to be unconstitutional. So they decided to come up with the 16th Amendment, which, of course, became very famous. And 16th Amendment, as you know, would become the so-called federal income tax, which is now collected by the IRS, Internal Revenue Service. And anyway, that's basically originally the first tax brackets that came out. It probably should be a 3,000, I guess, and above. Somewhere around 3,000 or 4,000, I think, is the range. But those that make around 3,000, I thought it was a 3,000 to 4,000 is about what it was. But first 3,000 or so, whatever money you make, and that's it, you don't pay any tax. And then anything above that, you have to pay some kind of percentage of tax, of course, afterwards. About 3 to 2. About 3 to 20,000, might be 4 to 20,000, somewhere around that range. You pay 1%. And then anybody above, like in the highest tax bracket, would pay like 5. If you're 500,000 or above, like say you're a millionaire, you'd pay 6% tax. Man, that's awesome. I wish we had that now again. So we pay way much more than that, now. So that was something he did, I guess signing the law, Wilson, the 16th Amendment. So that's one thing why some people don't like Wilson because of that. But the government, I guess, needed to find some way to collect revenue because they reduced the tariffs. That's the reason why they did it, think about it. And so that's what occurred. All right, then the other thing that he's known for, of course, Woodrow Wilson is also famous for developing the Federal Reserve System as well, like the central banking system of the United States is what it is. So he founded that also after he came in as well. And basically what it did was it created a U.S. national banking system with 12 Federal Reserve District banks that are all over the United States. So you can kind of see them right there. And I think we're in the one where Atlanta is and all that. And people later call it, as you know, the Fed. That's one of the nicknames they call the Federal Reserve, the Fed. And it's supervised by the Federal Reserve Board, which is based in Washington, D.C. They often control the interest rates, which can affect the economy. They also, control the circulation of money throughout the whole country. So this all can affect, the United States with its central banking system that we have. So that's something he was known for, Woodrow Wilson. Some people don't like it. I know the Fed. Some people want to get rid of it, but I guess it's here to stay. You can't get rid of it, I guess. All right. Now, also some other things he did too. He also created the federal. Oh, I'm missing a slide here that I've got. Trying to find where it is. I guess I don't have that one in there, but here it is. I forgot. It's right here. I want to go to this one first. He also created the Clayton Antitrust Act, 1914. Let me talk about that first. What that was. Clayton Antitrust Act was basically this act passed by Congress which strengthened the Sherman Antitrust Act. Apparently the Sherman Antitrust Act had not been strong enough. That was one of its big problems before. And so what it did was it made monopolies illegal. But what's really interesting about the Clayton Antitrust Act, there were provisions in it where it declared that unions and farm organizations had a right to exist and organize with various areas of corporations and companies, work fields, and all that in the country. So labor unions had a right to exist. Also, I think it said something like, says on the bottom there, that labor unions also had a right to peacefully strike, picket, boycott, equal bargaining. Those kind of things were things that they could do also as well. So you can see the main thing it did was it prohibited a corporation from acquiring stock or another of creating a monopoly. And it also prevented like monopolies themselves So basically, it's kind of trying to outlaw all pretty much, trusts and all that we talked about before. So that's basically what the Clayton Antitrust Act. It's kind of like a more stronger version of the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was originally in 1890 before. Now, yeah, going back to that slide I was going to talk about, they also had the Federal Trade Commission was created in 1914 as well. It became an independent agency. And this particular agency was important. What it basically did was created by Congress in 1914 to basically it advised and it regulated interstate commerce and foreign trade. That was one of the things it was mostly there for, not just interstate, but also, trade with different foreign countries in general. And part of why they created the FTC was it was there to help prevent the growth of monopolies. So it was kind of there to kind of guard over that and prevent it. And it was the one that pretty much, if you think about what it did, it pretty much enforced the Clayton Antitrust Act was one of the things it mostly did. But it also says, you see there, that brought in, better understanding between big business and federal government and the things that they are going to be later. How things are going to change, of course, with the development of the Clayton Antitrust Act. So that's all there to kind of enforce some, basically, issue trade regulation rules, various compliances they have to follow, and various proceedings that they have to do also as well. So those are all things that, happened under Wilson's administration. I will mention a few minutes on some things that, of course, also happened too under Woodrow Wilson. Don't forget, we had talked about this before, but Wilson's administration created 3 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. That's a lot for one administration to do. And of course, you can see, I think the only one that did that before was maybe Andrew Johnson's. They had all those other ones before. I guess it happened. But yeah, there's 3 of them. Of course, the first one they did, of course, in 1913. We talked about these before. The popular vote of U.S. senators in 1913. That was the first one, of course, that came out. So now after that, states could basically directly elect their own senators and they wouldn't be appointed. So a lot of that was done to prevent corruption in states where pretty much they just put in whoever they wanted to, rather than people having a say on who might get elected to the Senate in, of course, Washington, D.C. Of course, the other 2, of course, the first one we'll get to later. Of course, I'll get to the third one later, but the 18th Amendment, of course, was the next one that came out next, of course, which was the national prohibition of alcohol. What that did was it outlawed the making, the selling, the transportation of alcohol beverages, which, of course, eventually came after 1919. I'll get to it later, but a lot of this happened because of World War I, and they were kind of worried about there was a shortage of grain. And you had all these people that were sick of all the people drinking and getting drunk, the temperance movement. So they were kind of involved in it too, as well. But it's interesting. It basically banned, it from being made, sold, transported. Didn't say anything about drinking it. That's the funny thing about it. But it would start that era of prohibition, which would go on to, the 1920s that they have later. Then you have, of course, women's suffrage, the right to vote in the 19th Amendment. That would, of course, be the other thing that he also did, Wilson, right before he went out of office, 1921. And so he was known for that as well. Now, Wilson did run for re-election also as well. And I'll talk a few minutes about that. Also as well. I'm going to get to, I don't think we'll probably get to Mexico. We'll probably hold off on the conflicts with Mexico a little later, but I will talk about one more thing, of course, which is he does run for re-election in 1916. Wilson was pretty popular as president the first term because he had a lot of success, had a lot of reforms that he made. And so he ran for a second term. against Republican nominee Charles Evan Hughes, who was a former governor of New York. He was also a Supreme Court justice before that. I think still at the time he was. In fact, he was one of the first. I think he was one of the first sitting. Might have been one of the first sitting Supreme Court justices that ran for president. I think at the time. And so he had Wilson running against Charles Evan Hughes in that election. Then the Progressive Party in 1916, they tried to run a candidate again for a second time. They nominated Teddy Roosevelt to run for president, but Teddy Roosevelt didn't want to run. He turned it down. If you know the story about this, he was really worried that it would split the Republican Party like it did in 1912. And so he basically decided that I'm not going to do that. And so he pretty much got out of politics totally. Now, Wilson ran on a slogan, of course, you may have heard of, which is he kept us out of war. He also ran on another slogan you may have heard of called, just kind of familiar today, America First. I think it's something Trump is kind of running on, America First. And he came up with this slogan because in 1916 there was conflict going on in Europe. World War I had broken out in 1914. You had, of course, a case where Britain, France, and Russia were fighting against Germany, Austria-Hungary, so-called Great War, First World War I or World War I, they called it, which was really becoming a bloody conflict by 1916. And of course, there was fear that the United States would get dragged in to this war. And so Wilson made this promise that he would not get us involved in any European conflicts. Of course, Hughes, I told you about, Charles Evan Hughes, criticized Wilson. And he said that Wilson wasn't really preparing to even go to war. Like they weren't really trying to draft troops and create necessary preparations to face maybe a conflict which might break out over there in Europe, where we got to get involved. Also, I'll get to it later. I don't have time to do it today, but they also had the conflict in Mexico was breaking out. There was a case where Pancho Villa, who was a Mexican bandit, attacked New Mexico, killed a bunch of Americans. And that really angered a lot of people in the United States. There was talk of going to war with Mexico. Mexico was involved in they were involved in a Mexican Revolution, which lasted from 1910 to 1920. And we were almost drawn into it, if you know about it. So I probably don't have time to go into the Mexican Revolution because that's going to take a while. So I'll probably not do that today, but I'll probably talk about that starting next week on Tuesday. And I also, of course, mostly next Tuesday, I'll be getting into discussing World War I and how we got in the war and all that. But yeah, that's campaign slogan. It helped Woodrow Wilson defeat Charles Evan Hughes, the Republican, but it was a very close election. You can see there, Wilson only won by about 20-something electoral votes. So pretty close election. He wasn't that popular, I guess Wilson thought he was, basically. And you'll see later, Wilson actually has a stroke when he's in office. I don't know if you know about this, and he kind of came incapacitated. This is after World War I ended, but I'll get to that later, what happens. But he was actually for a while incapacitated. He couldn't really do much in office. So anyway, that's pretty much it today with talking, of course, about this period of, talking about Taft and Wilson and all that. Now, few reminders before I go. Don't forget that I did tell you about that assignment that is due. Remember that first exam is still up. I'll probably try to maybe keep it up a few days for you. So I'll try to maybe help you out on that, but you need to try to get that done as soon as possible. So get that done. So now, of course, I did tell you about that new assignment up about progressive era, also the U.S. imperialism. That Canvas quiz has also been posted too. Also quizzes as well. So make sure you start working on that as soon as possible. And I think that's it for now today. If you have any questions later about this assignment, let me know. And that's it pretty much overall. Hope you all have a good weekend coming up. And I'll have some more lectures up, of course, next week, which will mostly, like I said, be about World War One. So we're starting to get into like 1910s, World War One, and then we'll be shifting, of course, eventually to like the 1920s up to like the Roaring 20s and all that. So that's coming soon. Oh, by the way, next week is fall. I think it's fall break. I know next week. I know we don't have class next Thursday. I don't think. I guess we don't. I guess I can just put a lecture up. That's probably what I'll do, even though it's like a day off. I'll probably put one up anyway. So don't forget, I am going to have an announcement too next week, which I'll kind of remind some students, but I will have a makeup period coming up, like during the whole midterm week next week. So watch for emails, about that. If you miss an assignment, I am giving you time to make it up and all that. So that's it for today. I'll see y'all later. Fix that. And that's it. Hope y'all have a good weekend and all that. So take care. So I'll see you later.